They say betrayal cuts the deepest, but no one tells you what happens after the wound. When the people I trusted most shattered my world, I didn't just lose everything, I became someone I barely recognized. Half a year ago, my life took an unexpected and devastating turn. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary day at work, surrounded by the usual bustle and routine. That afternoon, a tense phone call with my wife, Kathy, caught me off guard. There was a sharpness in her voice I hadn't heard before. "We need to talk when you get home," she said abruptly before hanging up. At the time, I figured it was about our strained finances or some other everyday issue, but I couldn't have been more wrong. That evening, her words changed my life forever. "I've been seeing someone else," Kathy confessed, her eyes fixed anywhere but on me. The shock hit like a lightning bolt, leaving me frozen. Anger, disbelief, and heartbreak all wrestled for control as I sat there, speechless. This wasn't just betrayal, it was the unraveling of everything we had built together. To make matters worse, the man she had been involved with was Bob, a so-called friend who had sat at our dinner table more times than I could count. In the weeks that followed, emotions ran high. I did everything I could to save our marriage. We went to counseling, I compromised where I could, but it became painfully clear that Kathy's heart was no longer with me. The cracks in our relationship widened into chasms that no amount of effort could bridge. Friends and family tried to comfort me, but their sympathy only magnified the loneliness. The house that had once been my sanctuary became a constant reminder of everything I had lost. It wasn't long before the divorce process began. Each court hearing felt like reopening a fresh wound, and Kathy's relentless demands drained me further. As if that wasn't enough, Bob seemed to take pleasure in my misery. He made no effort to stay in the background, flaunting his relationship with Kathy at every opportunity. He even showed up at one of our neighborhood events, cornering me with smug comments and subtle threats. My fists clenched, and I could feel the rage building, but I forced myself to walk away. That night, sitting alone in the quiet of my home, something inside me broke, and then rebuilt itself. I realized I needed to fight back, not with anger or violence, but by reclaiming control of my life. In the weeks that followed, I channeled my pain and anger into self-improvement. The gym became my refuge, every lift, every mile run, felt like a step toward regaining my strength. I turned to hobbies I had abandoned years ago, finding peace in woodworking and running. Slowly, I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from, rebuilding a support system I hadn't realized I'd neglected during my marriage. Piece by piece, I started to reclaim my life. The process wasn't easy, but each small step forward felt like a victory. I was slowly putting the pieces of myself back together, though the scars Kathy and Bob had left were slow to fade. Nights were the toughest. The silence seemed to amplify every painful memory, forcing me to relive the betrayal again and again. Yet, even in the chaos of those sleepless nights, I found hope in the laughter of my children. Their innocence, their joy, it reminded me of what truly mattered. I made a promise to myself, no matter how broken I felt, I would be the father they needed. Someone solid. Someone dependable. They'd already seen too much of life's cruelty, and I couldn't let them feel the weight of it any more than they already had. By the time I found myself in that prison cell months later, one truth had cemented itself in my heart: no matter how shattered life becomes, it is always possible to rebuild. And that's exactly what I intended to do, one step at a time, starting the day I walked out of that place. It was close to 2 a.m. when I stared at the dimly lit walls of my cramped cell. The faint glow from the corridor lights barely pushed back the oppressive darkness. I lay there on the hard cot, hands behind my head, staring up at the ceiling as my thoughts churned restlessly. Memories I had desperately tried to bury clawed their way back to the surface. Sleep was an impossible dream. The quiet was broken by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. I began to count, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10 before the figure came into view. A guard, his face blank and expressionless, strode past my cell. This was just another routine patrol for him, a mundane part of his shift. He didn't even glance in my direction. I didn't mind, being invisible was a blessing in a place like this. Anger still burned inside me when I thought of the legal battles and the fees that had drained me dry. But I had learned to bury those feelings, to keep them locked away where they couldn't consume me. I understood now why men in here became hollow. Humanity doesn't survive in a place like this, just raw, cold survival. And even then, this prison was nothing compared to the harsher facility up north where some were sent. I closed my eyes, desperate for even a few moments of peace. My mind wandered back to my old bedroom, the one with the blackout curtains that used to keep the world at bay. That space had been my sanctuary, but that life, that version of me, was gone for good. Gary, one of the few people who had stuck by me, had come to visit at the correctional center. I could still hear his voice through the plexiglass. "I'll pick you up when you get out," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. And there wouldn't be any argument. Kathy and Bob had blindsided me, dismantling everything I had worked for and believed in. That life was over. But next time, I vowed, I'd be ready. I just had to make it through the next few days here, then begin the long road to rebuilding. Maybe then, finally, I could find a way to piece myself together again. Before everything fell apart, my life had been good, so good that I never saw the betrayal coming. Some friends admitted later that they had known about Kathy and Bob's affair but chose to stay quiet. Did they think I already knew and didn't care? Or were they just too afraid to get involved? Most people don't want to get tangled in someone else's mess. Now, all I had left was the will to survive and start fresh. If my husband were more of a man, we wouldn't even be in this mess, Connie once snapped in the middle of an argument. Her words cut through the air like a knife, leaving me at a loss for how to respond. "They'll either fix it or split," I told Kathy later, trying to sound neutral but already feeling the weight of where this was likely heading. "Bob's not going to put up with much more," she warned me, crossing her arms. "We're having dinner with them next week, by the way." I groaned, already dreading it. "Let's hope she behaves," I muttered, though I didn't believe it for a second. When the dinner finally rolled around, Connie was as disruptive as ever. "Waiter! How's a girl supposed to get a drink around here?" she yelled, loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. As if that wasn't enough, she pivoted her frustration onto Bob, berating him in front of everyone. His face turned red as he stared at his plate, silently enduring the verbal assault. I shifted uncomfortably before standing to excuse myself. As I passed Bob, I patted him on the shoulder. "Sorry, man," I offered, unsure of what else to say. He sighed heavily, shaking his head. "Thanks. I'm at my wit's end. I don't know what to do anymore." "You need counseling," I suggested gently. "Neither of you can handle this on your own. Kathy and I are here if you need support." Bob nodded, though I doubted they'd take my advice. Their marriage seemed to be on a collision course, and I figured it was only a matter of time before it imploded. 3 weeks later, the sound of sirens shattered the quiet of a Thursday night. Red and blue lights illuminated the end of the block, and I instinctively ran toward the commotion. Bob had taken a month off work to visit his family, and I'd promised to keep an eye on his house while he was away. Standing on the sidewalk, I felt an unsettling pit in my stomach as I watched the chaos unfold. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I turned to Kathy and said, "I love you, you know that, right?" She smiled softly, her face tired but kind. "I know. I love you too." Then she added with a small laugh, "If I ever end up like Connie, just pull the plug, okay? I wouldn't want to live like that." "Don't say things like that," I replied, shaking my head. Her words lingered, though, and as I held her close, I felt grateful for the life we shared, vowing silently never to let us reach such a point. Bob returned a couple of weeks later, looking tired and worn but determined to keep things together. For a while, it seemed like things were calming down, but there was an undercurrent of unease I couldn't ignore. I brushed it off, convincing myself that all marriages had their rough patches. Then came Friday, August 20th, the day my life fell apart. Kathy called me while I was at work. "The kids are staying at my parents' for the weekend," she said casually. "What time will you be home?" she asked. "I'll leave early," I replied, feeling a twinge of excitement for what I thought would be a romantic weekend for just the two of us. But when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed two cars parked there. One of them was Bob's. Confused, I walked inside to find Kathy and Bob standing in the kitchen together. "Hey, Bob," I greeted him, my brow furrowed. "What's going on?" They both froze, the guilt practically written across their faces. Without a word, they darted toward the door, avoiding my glare. As they slipped out, I stood there in the kitchen, my world collapsing around me. Vowing they wouldn't get away with this betrayal, I snapped. Fueled by rage, I grabbed a beer and downed it, then another. Over the next 2 hours, I let my anger take over. Dishes were smashed. The microwave was shattered. Four walls now bore gaping holes from my fists. By the time I finally stopped, the house looked like a war zone. But I wasn't done. For trips later, I'd cleared out Kathy's closet, dumping all her belongings on the lawn before turning on the sprinklers. Watching the water drench her clothes felt like a small, petty victory in a moment where I had lost everything else. I locked the doors, threw on the chains, and cracked open another beer, then 3 more. The quiet hum of the evening traffic outside was a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't stop my thoughts from spiraling, replaying every betrayal, every smug grin from Bob, and every empty excuse Kathy had made. The rage was a beast I couldn't contain. Without thinking, I grabbed my car keys and stormed outside. The next thing I knew, I was speeding down the street, spotting Bob's car parked in his driveway. My foot slammed on the gas. The crash was deafening as my car collided with his, shoving it into the garage door. My chest heaved as adrenaline pumped through me. I reversed, revved the engine, and rammed his car again, harder this time. On the third strike, I sent his car halfway through the garage before my engine sputtered and stalled. Fueled by raw anger, I grabbed my son's baseball bat from the back seat and charged at his car. Bob was still sitting in the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he cowered behind the shattered windshield. The sound of glass splintering filled the air as I swung wildly, shattering the side windows and leaving deep cracks in the windshield. I was seconds away from ripping open his door when I heard voices shouting behind me. "Drop the bat and put your hands on your head." I froze, turning slowly to see 2 police officers with their guns drawn. My grip on the bat loosened, and it clattered to the ground as I raised my hands. The rage still boiled beneath the surface, but I knew it was over, for now. Months later, sitting in what was left of my home, the weight of everything finally hit me. Bills were piling up, the house was cold and empty, and Kathy had taken the kids. I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey in front of me. "Maybe I should just start a fire in the living room to warm things up," I muttered bitterly. "Steve, stop talking like that," a voice said sharply, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was Kathy, her tone now tinged with concern. "Why can't you just move on?" "I will," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "As soon as you send my kids back." "I can't, not with you like this," she said, shaking her head. "I don't think you'd hurt them, but I can't take that chance. You'll see them, once you've calmed down and everything settles." "You don't have to worry about the kids," I said, glaring. "But you and Bob. That's another story." Kathy's expression hardened. "We're done talking," she said firmly, turning away and slamming the door behind her. The system wasn't done with me either. The judge handed down a 1-year sentence. "This is insane," I yelled at my lawyer after the hearing. "It could have been worse," he replied with a calm I couldn't share. "With good behavior, you'll be out in 8 months." The charge will clear in 2 years. Do your time, and move on. Move on. Easier said than done. Appeals went nowhere, and in under a year, my entire life had crumbled. Before turning myself in, my friend Chris reassured me. Your job's waiting for you when you get out. Stay smart, watch your back, and focus on getting through this. The Sunday before I reported to jail, I saw my kids one last time. Hugging them was like tearing open a wound I hadn't realized was still raw. Trading my prison jumpsuit for regular clothes 8 months later felt surreal. Walking out the gate, I spotted Gary waiting for me. To freedom, I said, clinking bottles with him at the first bar we found. Gary grinned. Andy's got a steak dinner waiting for you. You can crash with us for a few nights before you figure out the house. We talked about everything on the drive back. The house was still on the market with no offers. Kathy wanted to lower the price but needed my approval. Later that night, I stood in the kitchen, the air heavy with memories. The downstairs was a mess, needing repairs and cleaning. Sitting at the table, I grabbed a pen and paper and began making a list. Each item felt like another step forward, a small way to rebuild what had been destroyed. One day at a time. I tucked the list into my pocket and headed to the bank, hopeful for once that I might catch a break. When I checked the lockbox, though, it was no surprise to find it empty. Another blow, but I had learned not to expect anything else. I asked for documentation of the withdrawals, and the bank clerk mentioned they also had video footage of the lockbox area if needed. A call to my attorney later confirmed what I already suspected: Kathy had taken everything. The good news, my lawyer said, is that the court ordered restitution. You should start seeing something soon. I let out a bitter laugh, knowing it wouldn't undo the damage. Still, it was time to focus on rebuilding, on my own terms. Over the next 6 weeks, I poured everything I had into fixing the house. Repairs were made, the property was cleaned, and I even managed to get the CDs and bonds restored to the lockbox. It was slow progress, but for the first time in a long while, life felt like it might return to something resembling normal. When the kids came to stay for their first weekend back, there was an awkwardness that hung in the air. It felt like a fragile truce, neither of us knowing how to break the silence. Finally, I said, "This is still your home. You can speak your mind, don't worry about hurting my feelings." John looked at me hesitantly before speaking. "We love you, Dad. And we're sorry about what Mom did." Heather nodded in agreement. "We didn't know about Bob until we had to live with him. We didn't like it then, and we don't like it now." Their honesty hit me hard, but it also reassured me. We were still a family, no matter how broken things had become. It was a quiet Saturday when disaster struck again. The family was out at a soccer game when the fire started. Someone had poured gasoline along the electrical panel and the back of the property before setting it ablaze. By the time the fire department arrived, the rear half of the house was reduced to charred ruins, and the property was left without electricity. The very next day, 2 officers showed up at my doorstep. "Mr. Johnson, we need you to come with us for questioning," one of them said, his tone sharp with suspicion. At the station, they didn't waste time. "Steve, you were just a block away when the fire started. You could have easily been involved," the officer said, leaning forward as though daring me to slip up. Feigning ignorance, I raised an eyebrow. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was with friends all day, or should I say my friends now. Funny how you and Bob don't get invited anymore." The officer didn't bite, but his suspicion was clear. Later that night, Kathy called, her bitterness clear in her voice. "You have to stop this, Steve. You need to leave Bob out of it." "That's not going to happen," I said, my voice hardening. "That man means nothing to me. Someday, I'll be glad to spit on his grave." "Steve, I swear," she began, but I cut her off. "What's left, Kathy?" I snapped, my tone like ice. What more can you take from me? You cheated on me, divorced me, got me locked up. Haven't you done it all by now? She fell silent for a moment before hanging up in anger. As I put the phone down, I muttered to myself, hard to believe I once loved that woman. Determined to shake off the weight of the day, I threw myself into work. A new project at the plant had me busy, and I focused on staying sharp. When a colleague suggested grabbing dinner, I hesitated but ultimately agreed. The Hilton where I'm staying has a great restaurant, he said. How about 6? Sounds good, I replied, eager for a distraction. At 4:30, I left the plant, heading back to the hotel to prepare for the evening. For the first time in a while, I felt a flicker of hope for a fresh start, even if it was just dinner and small talk. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward. I spent about an hour working through emails, marveling at how anyone had managed their lives before the internet. At 5:55 p.m., I left for the restaurant, feeling calm and ready for the evening ahead. Once seated, I scanned the menu while waiting for Monica and her husband to arrive. True to form, Monica walked in right on time at 6. Her warmth had always been one of her defining qualities, and it seemed to fill the room as she greeted me. Over the course of dinner, we talked about lighter things at first, but eventually, the conversation shifted, and I found myself sharing parts of my life I usually kept hidden, the betrayals, the struggles, and the hard lessons I'd learned over the past 2 years. That's awful, Monica said, shaking her head in disbelief. You didn't deserve any of that. It's over now, I replied with a sigh. I'm trying to move forward. What choice do I have? She leaned in slightly, her expression softening. You've got a lot going for you, Steve. You're smart, funny, and good-looking. There are plenty of women who would jump at the chance to be with you. Her words struck a chord, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let my guard down. Monica's encouragement and sincerity made it easy to trust her. Over time, our relationship deepened into something more intimate, and I began to think that maybe I was ready to start something serious again. But then, everything unraveled. One Tuesday evening, after spending time together, Monica kissed me goodnight and said, "Let's plan for a long evening Thursday, just the two of us." "Thursday it is," I said, already making a mental note to prepare for a special night. The following evening, with no plans on my schedule, I decided to try a new restaurant I'd been curious about. It was a quiet little spot, cozy, with warm lighting and a great reputation for its sampler platter. As I chatted with the waiter, Monica's face suddenly popped into my mind. "You'd love this place," I thought to myself. The thought didn't last long because, moments later, I saw her. Monica was there. When I approached her table, her face went pale. "What a coincidence," she said, forcing a laugh. "I was at an Indian restaurant last night too. Crazy, right? I even ran into someone I knew." I locked eyes with her, my voice cold. "Monica, you don't have to pretend. Just tell me the truth." "Steve, I can explain," she stammered. "Don't bother," I cut her off. "I've dealt with enough lies before. I'm not going down that road again. I got rid of one deceitful woman, and I won't waste my time with another." With that, I turned and left, leaving Monica's excuses behind me. The next evening, I was chatting with my neighbor, Tom, outside when a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. 2 officers stepped out and approached us. "Mr. Moore, we need to ask you a few questions," the shorter officer said, his tone brisk. "Of course," I replied. I turned to Tom and added, "Let's pick up this conversation later." Tom lingered, casting a wary glance at the officers, before retreating back to his house. The taller officer stepped forward, flipping open a small notebook. "You own a black 2002 BMW 325i convertible, correct?" "That's right," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "There was an incident last night," he explained. "Your vehicle matches the description." I let out a short laugh. "So do hundreds of others in this city," I shot back. Do you have anything more specific, like a license plate or an eyewitness who can identify me? The officer hesitated before admitting, witnesses only saw the car. Well, I said, gesturing toward my driveway, as you can see, there's no fresh damage here. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly uncertain about their next move. I gestured around me, maintaining a calm tone. I can account for my whereabouts yesterday, from morning until evening. Why am I suddenly a suspect? The taller officer hesitated, his expression carefully blank. Your history with the victim complicates things, he finally said. The morning of the funeral, I made sure I looked sharp, a new suit, freshly polished shoes, and even a haircut. I washed and waxed my car, too. Every detail had to be perfect. As I arrived at the funeral home, the hum of quiet conversations outside abruptly stopped. All eyes turned toward me. Inside, I ignored the guest book and strode purposefully down the aisle. Kathy, seated near the casket with our children, froze when she saw me. Her expression shifted from shock to horror, and for a moment, she seemed paralyzed. She stood abruptly, trying to intercept me, but I was faster. I reached the casket, letting years of pent-up anger boil to the surface. Leaning over, I muttered under my breath, "Good riddance, Bob. Enjoy the dirt." Kathy's face turned red as she reached for my arm, her voice trembling. "Steve, what are you doing? This is not the time." I straightened up, brushing her off with a cold glare. "Paying my respects, just like everyone else," I said matter-of-factly before turning and walking out, leaving her standing there, seething. A week later, I found myself sitting across from two officers again, the tension in the air palpable. "Why would you hire someone to follow your ex-wife?" the taller officer asked, raising an eyebrow. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone even. "She seems to attract trouble," I explained. "And since my kids live with her, I thought it was best to ensure their safety." "Your ex-wife reported feeling followed," the officer said sharply. "She claims she saw the same man, Mr. Kint, multiple times and eventually called us. When we questioned him, he admitted you hired him. Is that illegal?" I asked calmly, my face unreadable. The officer frowned. "It's not against the law, but it's definitely unusual." I shrugged. Unusual isn't a crime. Kathy's desperation reached a boiling point during a late-night phone call. "What do you want from me, Steve?" she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. "Honestly?" I replied, my voice cool. "For you to drop dead." The line went silent for a moment before she hung up abruptly. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch with a drink in hand, a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. Two officers stepped out, their faces set with determination. I greeted them with mock enthusiasm. "Figured you'd show up sooner or later," I said with a smirk. Sunday morning, as I sipped coffee and read the newspaper on my deck, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened the door cautiously. Standing there were Kathy's parents, dressed in their Sunday best. "Steve, can we have a word?" her father asked politely. "Sure, come on in," I said, motioning them inside. They stepped in, but there was a formality to their movements, a stiffness that hinted at the purpose of their visit. Declining my offer of coffee, Kathy's father said, "We came to talk." It was just after sunset when the doorbell rang again. Peering through the peephole, I saw Kathy standing there, her expression a mix of nerves and defiance. She hadn't called ahead, which somehow made her unannounced arrival all the more satisfying. Opening the door, I leaned casually against the frame. "What do you want, Kathy?" I asked, keeping my tone deliberately neutral. I greeted her with a smirk. "Evening, Kathy. Care for a drink? How about hemlock?" "Do you ever stop being an idiot?" she snapped, pushing past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it. "What brings you by?" finally ready to admit you were wrong all along. Ignoring my jab, she settled stiffly onto the couch in the living room, her body language screaming discomfort. "You're not going to apologize, are you?" I asked, crossing my arms. "No," she said bluntly. "I didn't come here for that." "Predictable," I muttered, walking over to stand in front of her. "So why are you here, Kathy?" "Because if this is some kind of guilt-driven attempt to fix things, don't waste your breath." She exhaled slowly, clearly trying to steady herself. "I didn't come to fix anything, Steve. I came to talk. About us. About the kids." I scoffed. "The kids. Right. Now you care about how I feel." Her face tightened, but she pressed on. "You have to let go of this anger, Steve. Not for me, but for them. Let go. You really think this just happened? Don't insult me, Kathy. Nothing just happens unless someone makes it happen. Were you forced? Did Bob hold a gun to your head? Or did you go along willingly because he gave you something I didn't?" Her face remained stoic, but I could see the faintest flicker of guilt. "It wasn't about you, Steve," she said finally, her voice steady but soft. "It was about him. Bob needed me. He didn't have anyone else, and somewhere along the way. Somewhere along the way, you decided to destroy everything we built," I snapped, cutting her off. "And for what? Was he that much better in bed, Kathy? Was it worth burning down our marriage and shattering our family?" Her face hardened, but she didn't flinch. "You think this is all black and white, don't you? This is about my marriage," I shouted. "My family. How long, Kathy? How long did you let me play the fool while you and Bob carried on?" She sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to drain the room of any remaining energy. "Does it even matter?" she asked, exasperated. "It matters to me," I said firmly, locking eyes with her. 2 months. 3. 5. She hesitated before answering. "About 5 months," she admitted quietly. I leaned forward, my voice growing calm but cold. "I'm not here to convince you of anything, Kathy. You got custody because of what you pushed me to do. If I hadn't lost my temper and gone after Bob and his car, things could have been different." Her eyes flickered with unease as I continued, my tone dropping lower. "Bob got exactly what was coming to him. And now it's just you and me." Her composure cracked as her eyes widened. "Steve, are you threatening me?" "Threaten you? Never," I said with mock sincerity. "I'd never deprive my kids of their mother. But you know, life can be unpredictable." Her breath caught. "You're insane," she whispered. I smiled faintly. Bob had the exact same look on his face just before that car hit him. Too bad I didn't have a camera. She bolted for the door, panic overtaking her, and I didn't bother to stop her. As the door slammed shut behind her, I stood there, smirking in satisfaction. The truth was, I had started the fire at Bob's house. It didn't take much. 2 Gatorade bottles filled with gasoline and a cigarette were all I needed. I made sure the place was empty before I lit it up, but the fire didn't spread as quickly as I'd hoped. Still, I was in and out in under 5 minutes, tossing the bottles into a neighbor's recycling bin before anyone could notice. Months later, when my probation ended, I started seeing someone new. Ellen was sharp, and she didn't flinch when I told her about my past. Instead, she countered with stories of the lies and excuses she'd heard over the years from convicts she'd worked with. One night, as we sat together on her porch, she leaned in and said, "You need to let go, Steve. If you don't, you'll never move forward. And if you screw up and land back in jail, I'll personally make your life hell." She said it with a grin, but I didn't doubt her for a second. With Ellen, I was finally starting to figure things out, one step at a time.